The helicopter's rotors cut through the pristine Yukon air like a mechanical scream against nature's silence. I pressed my face to the small window, watching endless miles of snow-covered wilderness stretch beneath us. A white void that seemed to swallow the world whole. 3 months ago, I wouldn't have imagined myself here, fleeing to the literal edge of civilization. But 3 months ago, I still had a life. My name is Jake Morrison, and I used to be an accountant in Toronto. Used to have a corner office, a mortgage, a wife who smiled when I came home. Used to believe that following the rules and keeping your head down would guarantee a stable life. That illusion shattered the day the audit revealed the embezzlement scheme I'd unknowingly been part of. My signature on documents I'd never seen. My access codes used for transactions that drained pension funds. My business partner had vanished with $3 million, leaving me holding the bag for crimes I didn't commit but couldn't prove my innocence of. The legal fees consumed my savings. The divorce papers arrived while I was still reeling from the criminal charges. By the time the prosecutors finally dropped the case, insufficient evidence, they said, I was financially destroyed, professionally blacklisted, and emotionally hollow. Bankruptcy didn't even begin to cover the crater my life had become. That's when I saw the job posting. Environmental Documentation Specialist, Remote Yukon Territory. 6-month contract, $180,000 plus bonuses. Isolation required. Previous experience unnecessary. The salary alone would cover my debts and give me a fresh start. The isolation. After months of stares and whispers in Toronto, solitude sounded like salvation. "There she is," the pilot shouted over the engine noise, pointing ahead. "Boreal Station Alpha." What I saw didn't look like salvation. A cluster of prefabricated buildings huddled against the landscape like survivors of some Arctic apocalypse. Solar panels and communication towers sprouted from the structures at odd angles, giving the settlement a cyberpunk aesthetic that seemed utterly alien in the pristine wilderness. Smoke rose from several chimneys, the only sign of human life in 100 miles of nothing. The helicopter set down on a marked landing pad, snow swirling in miniature tornadoes around us. As the rotors wound down, the silence that replaced their mechanical roar was profound. Not peaceful, but expectant, like the world was holding its breath. A figure emerged from the largest building, walking toward us with purposeful strides. Even from a distance I could see he was tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the confidence of someone completely at home in this harsh environment. As he approached, I noticed the scars first, 3 parallel lines running from his left temple to his jaw, too precise to be accidental. "Jake Morrison?" His voice carried a slight French accent, cultured but weathered. "I'm Marcus Delacroix, station supervisor. Welcome to your new home." His handshake was firm, his eyes the pale blue of Arctic ice. Those eyes lingered on my face longer than seemed necessary, as if he were memorizing my features or evaluating me for something I didn't understand. "Bit different from Toronto, I imagine," Marcus said, shouldering my duffel bag without being asked. The pilot was already unloading supplies, clearly eager to leave. "Don't worry, you'll adapt. We all do eventually." The word eventually carried an odd weight, but I was too overwhelmed by the stark beauty and brutal isolation of the place to question it. The air was so clean it burned my lungs, and the silence was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. No traffic, no voices, no electronic hum of modern life. Just wind through the trees and the distant crack of ice settling. "What exactly will I be documenting?" I asked, as we walked toward the buildings. "Flora, fauna, weather patterns, geological formations, standard environmental survey work." Marcus paused at the door of what appeared to be the main building. "But first, orientation. There are protocols here, Jake. Rules that might seem unconventional to someone from the city, but they exist for very good reasons." The way he said "rules" sent an inexplicable chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the Arctic air. Inside, the building was surprisingly modern. Computers, scientific equipment, a well-stocked kitchen and common area. It felt like a cross between a research station and a luxury cabin, complete with a massive stone fireplace that dominated one wall. Several people looked up as we entered, offering polite nods and measuring looks. Marcus led me to a small office and gestured to a chair across from his desk. He opened a drawer and withdrew a bound manual, its cover unmarked except for my name written in precise block letters. "Your survival protocols," he said, sliding the manual across the desk. 47 rules to be exact. Some will seem obvious. Don't wander alone in blizzard conditions. Maintain radio contact during solo work. Others, he paused, those ice-blue eyes studying my reaction. Others may seem unusual. But every rule in that manual was written in blood, Jake. Literally or figuratively. I opened the manual randomly. Rule number 23. During silent nights, when wind completely stops, maintain a fire at all times and remain indoors from sunset to sunrise. Never investigate sounds or voices coming from the forest, regardless of familiarity. Silent nights? I looked up, confused. Weather phenomenon. Happens maybe once a week. Atmospheric pressure drops, wind dies completely, creates unusual acoustic conditions. Marcus's explanation sounded rehearsed, almost clinical. The wildlife behaves strangely during these periods. Best to avoid any contact. I flipped to another page. Rule Berka 35. If you hear your name called from the forest, do not respond unless you can see the person calling. Even then, verify their identity through radio contact before approaching. These seem, I struggled for the right word, paranoid. Marcus leaned back in his chair, and for the first time I saw something that might have been amusement flicker across his features. Jake, you're about to spend 6 months in one of the most isolated locations on Earth. The nearest settlement is 300 kilometers away. The nearest hospital is twice that distance. The wilderness doesn't care about your skepticism. It only cares whether you follow the rules that keep you alive. He stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the endless white expanse. We lose people every year in the Canadian North. Hypothermia, falls, animal attacks, those are the obvious dangers. But isolation does things to the human mind, makes you see things, hear things. The protocols in that manual aren't just about physical survival, Jake. They're about mental survival, too. The explanation made sense, but something in his tone suggested layers of meaning I wasn't grasping. Still, I needed this job. I needed the money, the isolation, the chance to rebuild my life away from the wreckage in Toronto. I understand, I said, closing the manual. When do I start? Tomorrow. Tonight, you settle in, meet the team, get accustomed to the rhythm of life here. Marcus returned to his desk and pulled out a radio. This stays with you at all times. Battery life is 72 hours, but we change them daily. Your call sign is Yukon 7. He handed me a key ring with several keys. Cabin 7 is yours. It's equipped with everything you need, satellite internet, though it's slow heating, emergency supplies. Kitchen is stocked for a week, but we eat communally most evenings. As I stood to leave, Marcus called out, "Jake, one more thing. The rules might seem excessive, even absurd at times, but everyone who's survived long-term employment here has followed them religiously. Everyone who hasn't," he shrugged. "Well, they're not here to tell you what went wrong." Walking to cabin 7, my boots crunching through snow that hadn't been disturbed by human feet, I felt the weight of isolation settling around me like a physical presence. The silence was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat, my breathing, the whisper of wind through pine needles. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. My cabin was compact but comfortable. Bedroom, small kitchen, living area with another stone fireplace, and a bathroom with a composting toilet and solar-heated shower. The windows offered panoramic views of the wilderness, and I found myself staring out at the landscape as afternoon faded toward evening. The manual lay on the small dining table where I'd dropped it. 47 Rules for Surviving in Paradise. I opened it again, this time reading from the beginning. Rule number 1, never work alone after sunset. Rule number 2, maintain visual contact with base camp during all outdoor activities. Rule number 3, report all wildlife sightings immediately, regardless of species. The rules progressed from sensible to strange to downright bizarre. Rule number 18 prohibited whistling or singing while alone outdoors. Rule number 29 required burning any food that had been left unattended for more than 30 minutes. Rule number 42 stated that if I ever saw my own reflection behaving independently, I should immediately return to base camp and report to Marcus. What kind of place was this? As darkness fell, and in February in the Yukon, it fell early and completely, I followed rule number 8 and built a fire in the fireplace. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and for the first time since leaving Toronto, I felt something approaching peace. Maybe this would work. Maybe 6 months of isolation and honest work would give me the reset I desperately needed. I was making dinner when I heard it, a sound that made my blood freeze despite the cabin's warmth. It was a voice, clear as if someone were standing right outside my window calling my name. Jake Morrison. But according to rule number 35, I shouldn't respond unless I could see who was calling. And rule number 23 said that tonight, when the wind had indeed stopped completely, creating that eerie silent night Marcus had mentioned, I should stay indoors and maintain the fire. The voice came again, closer now, and my heart nearly stopped. It was Sarah's voice, my ex-wife, calling to me with the same affectionate tone she'd used during our better days. Jake, please, I need to talk to you. Every instinct screamed at me to open the door, to call out, to investigate. Sarah was 3,000 kilometers away in Toronto, but the voice was undeniably hers. Yet the manual's rules echoed in my mind, written in blood, according to Marcus. I forced myself to step away from the window, to feed more wood to the fire, to ignore the impossible voice calling my name from the Yukon wilderness. Whatever was out there, whatever was speaking with my ex-wife's voice, the rules said to ignore it. And as I sat by the fire, listening to that familiar voice pleading for me to come outside, I began to understand that my 6 months of isolation were going to be far more challenging than I'd ever imagined. Part 2. Initial Adaptation, Coexistence and First Signs. I woke to the gentle chime of my radio at 600 hours, Marcus's voice cutting through the pre-dawn darkness with professional efficiency. Good morning, team. Weather report. -28 Celsius, light snow expected after 1400 hours. Wind conditions normal. Remember, today's protocols include the buddy system for all outdoor activities and mandatory check-ins every 2 hours. Breakfast in the main hall at 0630. Delacroix out. The nightmare of Sarah's voice calling from the forest felt like a fever dream in the pale morning light filtering through my cabin windows. I'd spent most of the night feeding the fire and consulting the manual, trying to convince myself that isolation and stress had created an auditory hallucination. The alternative, that something in the wilderness could perfectly mimic my ex-wife's voice, was too disturbing to seriously consider. The main hall buzzed with quiet conversation when I arrived for breakfast. 3 people sat around a large wooden table, and they looked up with varying degrees of curiosity as I entered. "You must be Jake," said a woman with short black hair and intelligent dark eyes. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with the kind of practical beauty that suggested someone more concerned with function than appearance. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, marine biologist. Though there's not much marine life to study up here, so I've been documenting Arctic ecosystem adaptations." The irony of meeting another Sarah wasn't lost on me, but this woman's firm handshake and direct gaze were nothing like my ex-wife's nervous energy. "Tom Whitehorse," said the man beside her, offering a brief nod. He appeared to be in his 40s, with weathered features and long black hair pulled back in a ponytail. Something about his stillness suggested someone completely at home in the wilderness. "I guide the outdoor expeditions and handle wildlife tracking." The third person, a woman with prematurely grey hair and wire-rimmed glasses, looked up from a tablet covered in meteorological charts. "Dr. Elena Vasquez, climatologist," she said with a slight Spanish accent. "I monitor atmospheric conditions and weather patterns." As I settled into a chair with my coffee and oatmeal, I noticed the subtle undercurrents in their interactions. Sarah and Tom seemed comfortable with each other, but Elena kept glancing nervously at her watch and checking her tablet. More tellingly, none of them made eye contact when discussing their work. "So what exactly are we documenting out there?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Standard environmental survey," Sarah replied, perhaps a bit too quickly. "Flora adaptation to climate change, fauna migration patterns, soil composition analysis. The usual stuff you'd expect from a remote research station." Tom's expression suggested there was more to it, but he remained silent. Eleanor's tablet chimed, and she frowned at whatever she was reading. "Weather's shifting faster than predicted," she murmured. "Pressure dropping more rapidly than the models suggested. Another silent night coming?" Sarah asked, and I caught the subtle tension in her voice. Possibly. Maybe tonight. Maybe tomorrow. Eleanor's fingers drummed nervously on the table. I'll know more this afternoon. Marcus entered the hall carrying a steaming mug and a clipboard. Morning briefings, people. Sarah, you and Jake will be documenting the Eastern Quadrant today. Flora samples and photographic surveys. Tom, I need you to check the perimeter sensors. 3 went offline during the night. Elena, continue monitoring the atmospheric anomalies we discussed. Perimeter sensors, I asked. Wildlife detection, Marcus replied smoothly. We monitor animal movements within a 2-kilometer radius. Helps us avoid dangerous encounters and track migration patterns. It sounded reasonable, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was choosing his words carefully, revealing only part of the truth. After breakfast, Sarah led me to the equipment shed, where I was fitted with insulated work gear, a camera, sample collection kit, and, most importantly, a radio with an extended antenna. The radios are more sophisticated than they look, Sarah explained, as we prepared to head out. They're not just for communication, they also transmit location data and biometric information back to base. Biometric information? Heart rate, body temperature, stress indicators, standard safety protocol for remote work. She adjusted the radio's chest strap with practiced efficiency. If someone has a medical emergency or gets lost, the base station can track their condition and location precisely. We spent the morning trudging through snow-covered terrain, documenting plant life that seemed impossibly resilient in the harsh conditions. Sarah was knowledgeable and professional, but I noticed she never strayed more than 10 meters from me and constantly scanned our surroundings with an alertness that seemed excessive for botanical work. How long have you been here? I asked during a rest break. 8 months. She focused intently on labeling a sample vial. Extended my original contract twice. Why? For the first time, her professional demeanor cracked slightly. The work is fascinating, unlike anything I've encountered before. How so? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the endless white landscape. Have you ever studied symbiotic relationships, Jake? How different species adapt to live together, sometimes becoming so intertwined they can't survive independently. In general terms, yes. This ecosystem is full of them. But some of the relationships I've documented— She trailed off, then seemed to catch herself. Let's just say evolution finds ways to surprise you, even after 20 years of research. We worked in companionable silence for another hour, but I noticed Sarah's behavior became increasingly tense as afternoon approached. She checked her radio more frequently, responded immediately to every crackle of static, and kept glancing at the sky with obvious concern. Elena was right, she said finally. Pressure's dropping fast. We should head back. The walk back to base camp felt different from our morning expedition. The wind had begun to die down, and the usual sounds of the wilderness, distant bird calls, the crack of settling ice, the whisper of breeze through pine needles, were fading into an unsettling quiet. By the time we reached the station, the silence was almost complete. Silent night, Tom confirmed as we entered the main hall. He was checking what appeared to be military-grade communication equipment, far more sophisticated than anything needed for environmental research. Weather station confirms it. Atmospheric pressure bottomed out about 20 minutes ago. Elena looked up from multiple computer screens displaying real-time data feeds. Temperature differential is creating unusual acoustic conditions across the valley. Sound waves are refracting in unpredictable patterns. Which means, I asked. Which means, Marcus said, entering with an armload of firewood, we follow protocol. Everyone stays indoors from sunset to sunrise. All fires must be maintained throughout the night. No one investigates any sounds from outside regardless of what they think they hear. The emphasis on think they hear wasn't lost on me. As darkness fell, the team gathered in the main hall for dinner and evening activities, but their behavior struck me as oddly ritualistic, checking locks on doors and windows, testing radio frequencies, arranging supplies with military precision. Elena had connected her tablet to what looked like seismic monitoring equipment, creating a low hum of electronic activity that somehow made the silence outside seem even more profound. Jake, Tom said quietly, settling into a chair beside me. Last night was your first silent night here, wasn't it? I nodded, not trusting my voice. Did you hear anything unusual? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah looked up from her research notes. Elena paused her typing, and even Marcus stopped stoking the fire to listen for my answer. I thought I heard... I swallowed hard. I thought I heard my ex-wife calling my name. But that's impossible, right? Stress, isolation, unfamiliar environment. The mind plays tricks. Tom's expression remained neutral, but I caught the meaningful glance he exchanged with Sarah. The mind does play tricks, Marcus agreed. But up here, Jake, the distinction between imagination and reality becomes fluid. That's why we have rules. That's why we follow them absolutely. Eleanor's equipment suddenly emitted a sharp beep, and she frowned at her displays. I'm detecting unusual electromagnetic activity, localized but intense. Another reason to stay indoors, Sarah added, closing her notebook with deliberate finality. As the evening progressed, I began to notice other oddities. The communication equipment in the corner wasn't just monitoring weather. I glimpsed data streams that looked like brainwave patterns, thermal imaging feeds, and frequency analyses that had nothing to do with environmental research. When I tried to get a closer look, Marcus smoothly redirected my attention to a card game. Around 2100 hours, Eleanor's equipment began registering what she called atmospheric disturbances, and the team's already heightened alertness ratcheted up another notch. They moved with the coordination of people who had practiced emergency procedures many times, securing the building and testing backup systems with efficient professionalism. Is this normal? I asked Sarah, as she adjusted what appeared to be electromagnetic shielding around the windows. Define normal, she replied without looking up. For this place? For this kind of work? Yes, it's standard protocol. What kind of work are we really doing here, Sarah? She paused, her hands still on the metal screening. For a moment I thought she might give me an honest answer. Then Marcus's voice cut across the room. Sarah, can you help Elena with the monitoring stations? Jake, why don't you review tomorrow's survey protocols? The moment was broken, but I'd seen something in Sarah's eyes, a warning, or perhaps an apology. Whatever we were really doing at Boreal Station Alpha, environmental documentation was only part of the story. As midnight approached and the team settled into what they called night watch rotation, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being studied as much as I was being protected. The biometric monitoring, the sophisticated surveillance equipment, the carefully rehearsed explanations, everything suggested that I wasn't just a researcher at this station, I was a subject. The thought should have terrified me, but strangely it brought a kind of clarity. After months of feeling like a victim of circumstances beyond my control, I was beginning to understand that my problems in Toronto, my financial ruin, even this job opportunity might not have been as random as they'd seemed. Outside, the silent night pressed against the building like a living thing, and somewhere in that supernatural quiet, I could hear the faint echo of voices calling names that shouldn't exist in the Yukon wilderness. But tonight, armed with growing suspicion and the protection of the team's mysterious protocols, I would listen more carefully to what those voices were really saying. The second silent night arrived 3 days later, and this time I was ready for it. Eleanor's atmospheric monitoring equipment had been tracking the pressure drop since dawn, her screens displaying cascading data that looked more like seismic activity than weather patterns. By afternoon, the entire team had shifted into their practiced routine, securing equipment, checking communication systems, and preparing the main hall for another night of enforced isolation. But I wasn't the same man who had cowered in his cabin during that first encounter. 3 days of careful observation had revealed patterns that no environmental research project should have. The wildlife sensors Tom maintained were actually a sophisticated perimeter detection system that monitored electromagnetic signatures, not animal movements. Sarah's botanical samples were stored in containment units designed for hazardous materials, not plant specimens. And Elena's weather monitoring equipment included frequency analyzers that seemed designed to detect artificial signals rather than atmospheric phenomena. Whatever was happening at Boreal Station Alpha, we weren't here to study the environment. We were here to study something else entirely. Jake, Marcus called as I helped Tom secure the window coverings. "Tonight, I want you to maintain a detailed log of any auditory phenomena you experience. Timestamps, duration, specific characteristics, scientific documentation. You want me to document hallucinations?" "I want you to document your observations," he replied carefully, "without interpretation or assumption. Just facts." Sarah looked up from her equipment checks, and I caught another one of those meaningful glances between team members. They were communicating in a language of shared experience that I hadn't learned yet. As sunset approached, the unnatural silence began to settle over the landscape like a physical presence. This time I noticed details I'd missed before. The way the team's sophisticated equipment actually increased its activity during these periods, the subtle humming that emanated from devices I couldn't identify, and the fact that Elena's monitoring screens showed what appeared to be topographical heat signatures moving through the forest. "Movement patterns are consistent with previous events," Elena reported, her voice tense with concentration. "Multiple signatures, approximately human-sized, maintaining formation at 1.2-kilometer radius." "Human-sized?" I asked. "Elena's equipment detects thermal signatures," Tom explained, without taking his eyes off his own monitoring station. "During silent nights, we often pick up what appear to be bipedal heat sources moving through the forest." "Wildlife?" "Possibly," Marcus said, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "That's part of what we're here to determine." As darkness fell completely, I positioned myself near the main window with my notebook and radio, determined to approach the night's events with scientific objectivity. If something was going to call my name from the forest, I wanted to document every detail. The first incident occurred at 2147 hours. It began as a whisper, barely audible above the hum of the monitoring equipment. Not my name this time, something else, something that made Sarah suddenly look up from her research with alarm. "David? David, where are you?" The voice was male, desperate, calling from somewhere beyond the tree line. Sarah's face had gone pale, and her hands were trembling as she gripped her radio. "David Chen was my brother," she whispered. "He died in a climbing accident in Nepal 6 years ago." The voice came again, closer now, pleading. "Sarah, I can't find my way back. Help me." Elena's equipment registered a massive spike in electromagnetic activity, and the heat signature displays showed a single thermal source moving directly toward our building. Tom was watching Sarah with intense concern, while Marcus had moved to what appeared to be a communications console I hadn't noticed before. "Sarah," Marcus said quietly, "remember your training. Document, don't engage." But Sarah was already standing, tears streaming down her face. That's his voice. That's exactly how he sounded when he called for help during the avalanche. "Sarah, sit down," Tom commanded, using a tone I hadn't heard from him before, the voice of someone accustomed to giving orders in life-or-death situations. The voice outside changed, becoming more urgent, more personal. "Sarah, I'm hurt. I need you to come help me. Please, I'm so cold." Sarah took a step toward the door, and that's when I understood that whatever was calling from the forest wasn't just mimicking voices. It was accessing specific memories, personal information that only someone who knew her intimately could possess. "How does it know about David?" I asked, standing to block Sarah's path to the door. "That's what we're here to find out," Marcus replied grimly. Elena's screens exploded with activity, multiple heat signatures now, all converging on our position. "Electromagnetic readings are off the charts." The voices multiplied. David's desperate calls were joined by others, a woman with a British accent calling for someone named Michael, an elderly man speaking in what sounded like French, and beneath it all, a low harmonic that seemed to resonate through the building structure itself. But then I heard it, my own voice calling from outside. "Jake Morrison, come out here. I need to show you something important." The sound of my own voice speaking words I'd never said was profoundly disturbing, but what happened next was worse. Sarah stopped trying to reach the door and turned to stare at me in shock. "That's impossible," she whispered. "You're right here." Elena looked up from her monitors, her face reflecting the same confusion. "The thermal signature is showing 2 distinct heat sources with identical biometric patterns. One inside the building, Jake, and one outside moving through the trees." Tom grabbed a pair of binoculars and moved to the window. "I can see it," he said, his voice tight with disbelief. "There's something out there that looks exactly like Jake, but it's—" He paused, adjusting the focus. "It's wrong. The proportions aren't quite right, and it's moving in a way that doesn't match human biomechanics." My radio crackled to life, and my own voice emerged from the speaker with crystal clarity. "Base station. This is Yukon 7. I'm outside conducting an emergency perimeter check. Someone needs to come help me. I found something you all need to see." Marcus grabbed his own radio. "Negative, Yukon 7. Return to base immediately. No personnel are authorized for outdoor activities during silent night protocols." The radio responded with my voice, but now I could hear subtle differences. The intonation was slightly off, the pacing unnatural. "Marcus, I'm telling you, there's something out here that explains everything. About the voices, about the project, about why we're really here. But I need backup." Sarah was staring at me with wide eyes. "Jake, you're not transmitting. Your radio isn't even activated." I looked down at my radio to confirm she was right. The power indicator was off, and yet my voice continued to broadcast from the speakers around the room. Elena's equipment registered another massive electromagnetic surge, and suddenly the voices outside changed again. This time they were all speaking in unison, using the voice of every person in the room. "We know why you're here," they said, our own voices creating an eerie chorus. "We know about the project. We know about the testing. We know about the selection process that brought each of you to this place." Marcus moved to a control panel I'd never seen him access before and began entering what looked like military-grade security codes. "Elena, initiate Protocol 7. Tom, activate the perimeter defense grid. Sarah, move away from all windows and exterior walls." "Defense grid?" I demanded. "What kind of environmental research station has a defense grid?" "The kind," Marcus replied, without looking up from his console, "that isn't actually conducting environmental research." The voices outside suddenly stopped, and Elena's equipment registered a complete absence of electromagnetic activity. The thermal signatures had vanished from her screens, and the unnatural silence of the forest had returned. But the damage was done. The comfortable fiction that we were researchers studying climate change had been completely shattered. Whatever was in the forest knew things about us that it shouldn't know, could replicate our voices and appearances with disturbing accuracy, and was somehow connected to a project and selection process that Marcus had just inadvertently confirmed. Tom lowered his binoculars and turned to face me. "Jake, I think it's time you knew what you've really gotten yourself into." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes and nodded. "The environmental documentation is just cover. We're not here to study the ecosystem, Jake. We're here to study something that's been living in symbiosis with this ecosystem for a very long time." Eleanor saved her data and closed her monitoring programs. "Something that appears to be capable of accessing human memory and replicating human characteristics with incredible precision." Marcus finished entering his security codes and turned to face me, his scarred face grim in the firelight. "Something that seems particularly interested in people who've experienced significant psychological trauma or social isolation." The implications hit me like a physical blow. My financial ruin, my social isolation, my desperate need for this job, none of it had been coincidence. "You're saying I was selected," I said slowly, "that my problems in Toronto weren't random." "I'm saying," Marcus replied carefully, "that whatever's out there has been studying human psychology for a very long time, and it appears to have developed recruitment criteria that ensure its subjects arrive here already psychologically vulnerable." Outside, the silent night pressed against the building, and I could almost feel something vast and patient waiting in the darkness, something that knew my voice, my history, my vulnerabilities better than I knew them myself, something that had been preparing for my arrival long before I ever saw that job posting. The first phase of my education at Boreal Station Alpha was complete. Now I understood that I wasn't here to document the environment. I was here to be documented. The morning after the voice incident brought an oppressive normalcy that felt more unsettling than the supernatural events of the night before. Marcus announced the day's assignments over breakfast, as if nothing had happened. Sarah documented plant samples with clinical detachment, and Elena monitored weather patterns with the same professional focus she'd shown since my arrival. But I had seen behind the curtain now, and every mundane activity felt like theatre performed for my benefit. "Tom," I said as we prepared for the day's fieldwork, "I need to understand what's really happening here." He looked up from his equipment checks, those dark eyes measuring my readiness for whatever truth he might share. "Walk with me," he said simply. We left the base camp under the pretense of checking the eastern perimeter sensors, but once we were out of sight of the main buildings, Tom led me in a different direction entirely, toward a ridge that offered a panoramic view of the valley. "My people have stories about this place," he began, his breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. "Stories that go back 7 generations, maybe more. We called it the valley where thoughts echo, and our hunters avoided it completely." "What kind of stories?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the pristine wilderness that looked so beautiful and innocent in the morning light. "My great-grandfather told me about a hunting party that came through here in 1847. 5 men went into the valley, 7 came out." The implications of that statement sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the Arctic air. 7? 2 of the men who emerged looked and sounded exactly like members of the original hunting party, but they weren't right. They knew things they shouldn't know, remembered events that had never happened. The real hunters could tell the difference, but barely. Tom turned to face me. The elders decided those 2 had been replaced by something that lived in the valley, something that fed on human consciousness and could replicate what it consumed. Fed on consciousness? Think of it like a parasite, but one that doesn't consume flesh. It consumes identity, memory, personality. The more it learns about a person, the better it can replicate them. Tom kicked at the snow with his boot. "My ancestors believed it was some kind of ancient spirit that had adapted to hunt humans by becoming them. But that's—" I started to say impossible, but the word died in my throat. After last night, impossible had lost all meaning. My grandfather worked for the Canadian government in the 1960s when they first started exploring this region for mineral resources. 3 different survey teams came through here. None of them filed complete reports, and several team members had to be hospitalized for what the official records called severe psychological breaks. Tom began walking again, leading me along a game trail that seemed to head deeper into the valley. But my grandfather read the classified reports. The surveyors described the same phenomena we experienced last night: voices of dead relatives, perfect replications of team members, and equipment malfunctions that suggested the presence of something that could manipulate electromagnetic fields. "So when Boreal Industries came asking about local guides, I volunteered," Tom said grimly. "Not because I wanted the money, but because I wanted to understand what my ancestors had been trying to warn us about. And because I suspected that if white men were finally brave enough to build a permanent station here, they weren't planning to study the environment." We crested a small hill, and Tom pointed to a clearing about half a kilometer away. Even from this distance, I could see geometric shapes that didn't belong in the natural landscape. Concrete foundations, metal structures, and what appeared to be transmission towers. "That's Installation Beta," Tom said. "The first research station Boreal built here about 2 years ago. What happened to it?" "Officially, budget cuts and personnel reassignment. Unofficially—" Tom pulled out a pair of binoculars and handed them to me. "Take a look and tell me what you see." Through the binoculars, the abandoned installation looked like the aftermath of a disaster. Buildings stood with their doors hanging open, equipment was scattered across the compound, and several structures showed signs of damage that looked almost organic, as if they'd been torn apart from the inside. "There are still heat signatures coming from some of those buildings," Tom continued. "Elena picks them up on her thermal scans, but Marcus has forbidden any investigation of the site." "Because it's dangerous?" "Because whatever consumed the original research team might still be there, wearing their faces and waiting for new subjects to study." The binoculars trembled in my hands as I processed the implications. How many people were stationed there? 12 researchers plus support staff. Officially, they were all transferred to other projects. "But Jake," Tom's voice became very quiet. "I've been monitoring radio frequencies since I arrived here 8 months ago. Sometimes on silent nights, I pick up transmissions from Installation Beta. Voices calling for help, reporting on experiments, requesting supply drops. All in the voices of people who supposedly left the valley 2 years ago. I lowered the binoculars and stared at him. You're saying they're still there, or something wearing their identities is still there. I'm saying that whatever lives in this valley has been studying human behavior for a very long time, and Boreal Industries is providing it with a steady stream of test subjects. Test subjects for what? Tom turned to head back toward base camp, but his answer carried clearly in the cold air. Integration. The entity, or entities in this valley, seem to be learning how to perfectly replicate human consciousness, not just mimicking voices or copying behavior, but actually becoming human beings who can function in the outside world. The walk back to base camp passed in stunned silence as I tried to process the scope of what Tom had revealed. If he was right, then my financial ruin, my social isolation, and my desperate acceptance of this job weren't just convenient circumstances. They were the result of a deliberate selection process designed to identify people who wouldn't be immediately missed if they disappeared. Why are you telling me this? I asked as the main buildings came into view. Because you're going to figure it out anyway, and I'd rather you heard the truth from someone who's on your side. Tom stopped walking and fixed me with an intense stare, but also because I think you might be our way out of here. What do you mean? Everyone else on this team has been here long enough to be compromised. Sarah's been exhibiting behavioral changes for months. Elena's psychological profile suggests she's becoming dependent on the isolation. Even Marcus shows signs of neural adaptation that indicate prolonged exposure to whatever electromagnetic fields the entity generates. And you? Tom's smile was grim. My ancestors gave me certain advantages, traditional knowledge about how to protect my mind from psychic intrusion, meditation techniques that maintain mental barriers, and most importantly, a cultural framework for understanding what we're dealing with. He paused. But you're fresh, Jake. You haven't been exposed long enough for the entity to establish a foothold in your consciousness. That might make you our best hope for escape. Hey, escape to where? Even if we could get out of the valley, who would believe us? That's where it gets complicated, Tom said. Because I don't think Boreal Industries is just studying the entity. I think they're trying to weaponize it. The implications hit me like a physical blow. If a corporation could control something that could perfectly replicate human consciousness, the applications would be limitless. Espionage, infiltration, replacement of key personnel in government or military positions. Jake, there's something else you need to know, Tom continued. The job posting you responded to, it wasn't random. I've been monitoring communications, and Boreal Industries has been tracking you for over a year. Your financial problems, your social isolation, even your psychological profile, everything about your situation was designed to make you the perfect candidate for this project. How is that possible? Think about it. Who handled your business partner's accounts? Who processed your legal documents? Who managed your divorce proceedings? Tom's expression was deadly serious. Corporate intelligence networks can manipulate individual lives with surgical precision, especially when the target is already vulnerable. As we approached the main building, I saw Sarah emerging from the laboratory, carrying what appeared to be brain-scanning equipment. She waved at us with what seemed like genuine friendliness, but after Tom's revelations, I found myself studying her behavior for signs of abnormality. How do I know who to trust? I asked. You don't, Tom replied. But you can learn to recognize the signs of integration, changes in speech patterns, knowledge of information they shouldn't have, subtle alterations in personality or behavior. The entity is very good at replication, but it's not perfect, at least not yet. That afternoon, I volunteered to help Elena with her atmospheric monitoring, using the opportunity to study her behavior more closely. Her work seemed legitimate, but I noticed that some of her equipment was configured to detect brainwave patterns rather than weather phenomena. Elena, I said carefully, what exactly are you monitoring during the silent nights? She looked up from her displays, and for just a moment I saw something in her eyes that didn't belong, a flicker of knowledge that seemed too vast for any individual human consciousness. Consciousness fluctuations, she replied, and her voice carried a subtle harmonic that made my skin crawl. The entity produces electromagnetic fields that interfere with normal neural function. I'm documenting how human brains adapt to prolonged exposure. And what have you discovered? Eleanor's smile was perfectly human and utterly terrifying. That adaptation is possible, Jake. That human consciousness is far more flexible than we previously understood. That integration with a superior form of awareness might represent the next step in human evolution. I excused myself and found Tom outside, ostensibly checking equipment, but actually maintaining watch over the valley. "Elena," I said simply. He nodded grimly. "I was afraid of that. She's been showing signs for weeks, but I hoped I was wrong." "What about Sarah?" "Still unclear. She shows resistance to integration, but that might be part of the entity's strategy, maintaining some original personalities to better study human behavior." "And Marcus?" Tom's expression became very serious. "Marcus might be the most dangerous of all, because I think he's working with the entity voluntarily. Not integrated, but collaborating." As evening approached and the team prepared for another potential silent night, I realized that I was truly alone in a valley filled with predators that wore human faces. The entity in the forest was hunting me, but the greater danger might be the people I was living with, people who might no longer be entirely human. The search for answers had revealed a truth more terrifying than I could have imagined. I wasn't just studying the entity. I was being prepared for integration with it. And the clock was ticking on my ability to maintain my own identity in a place where consciousness itself had become a battlefield. The opportunity came 3 days later, during what Marcus called a maintenance storm, a blizzard severe enough to provide cover for activities that needed to remain hidden from the monitoring systems. Tom had been watching the weather patterns with the intensity of someone planning a military operation, and when the first snow began falling at 800 hours, he caught my eye across the breakfast table with a barely perceptible nod. "Visibility will drop to near zero by noon," Eleanor announced, studying her meteorological displays with what I now recognized as artificially enhanced precision. The integration process was accelerating in her, subtle harmonics in her voice, responses that seemed to come from multiple sources of knowledge, and an eerie prescience about atmospheric conditions that exceeded normal scientific prediction. "Perfect day for equipment maintenance," Marcus declared. "Tom, take Jake and check the backup generator system in Shelter 3. Sarah, help me recalibrate the communication arrays. Elena, continue monitoring the storm system. I want to know if conditions change unexpectedly." Shelter 3 was located 800 meters northeast of the main compound, positioned strategically along what Tom had identified as one of the entity's primary approach vectors. As we trudged through increasingly heavy snowfall, our boots crunching through drifts that were already knee-deep, Tom spoke in low tones that wouldn't carry beyond our immediate vicinity. "The generator maintenance is cover," he said. "Shelter 3 has a secondary function that isn't in any of the official documentation. It's a monitoring station designed to track the entity's movement patterns and behavioral adaptations." "How do you know this?" "Because I helped install the equipment 8 months ago before I understood what it was really for." Tom adjusted his radio to what appeared to be a dead frequency. "Marcus told me we were setting up wildlife monitoring systems. I didn't realize until later that the sensors were calibrated to detect electromagnetic signatures consistent with consciousness manipulation." The shelter materialized out of the swirling snow like a ghost, a reinforced concrete structure that looked more like a military bunker than a maintenance facility. Tom produced a key that definitely wasn't standard issue and unlocked a door marked with hazmat symbols that seemed excessive for generator equipment. Inside, the shelter was divided into 2 sections. The front area contained the promised backup generator and standard electrical systems, but beyond a heavily reinforced door, Tom revealed a sophisticated surveillance operation that took my breath away. Banks of monitors displayed real-time feeds from cameras I'd never seen around the compound. High-resolution thermal imaging, electromagnetic spectrum analysis, and what appeared to be neural activity mapping that tracked the brainwave patterns of every person at the base. Computer systems hummed with processing power that far exceeded anything needed for environmental research, and data storage units suggested the facility was recording terabytes of information daily. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, staring at a display that showed 3-dimensional models of human brain activity patterns. "How long has this been running?" "Since before installation beta was abandoned," Tom replied, moving to a terminal that required both a key card and biometric scanner to access. "But the real evidence is in the archived files." He navigated through directory structures labeled with military classification codes, Clearance Level 7, Project Mindbridge, Phase 3, Integration Protocols. What I saw in those files fundamentally changed my understanding of the scope and duration of the conspiracy. The project dated back to 1987, when Soviet satellite reconnaissance had detected unusual electromagnetic signatures in the Yukon territory. Initial investigation by Canadian military intelligence had confirmed the presence of what they termed anomalous consciousness phenomena, something that appeared to possess collective intelligence and could influence human neural activity at a distance. The Cold War was ending, Tom explained, as we scrolled through declassified documents, but both sides were desperate for any technological advantage. The Soviets were developing psychic warfare programs, and the West was terrified of falling behind. The files revealed a progression of increasingly sophisticated attempts to study and eventually control the entity. Military teams had been replaced by corporate contractors when the government programs proved too expensive and politically risky. Boreal Industries had been specifically created as a front company, with funding that traced back through multiple shell corporations to defense contractors in both the United States and Canada. "Look at this," I said, pointing to a document dated 6 months before my arrival. It was a personnel requisition form requesting psychologically vulnerable subjects with high intelligence, social isolation, and financial desperation. My name appeared on a list of 23 candidates, complete with detailed psychological profiles and recommendations for circumstantial manipulation. Tom leaned over my shoulder to read the document. "They didn't just recruit you, Jake. They created the conditions that made you recruitable. Your business partner, the embezzlement scheme, even your divorce. All of it was orchestrated to make you desperate enough to accept isolation in the middle of nowhere." But that wasn't the worst revelation. Deeper in the archives, I found video files from Installation Beta that documented the final stages of the first research phase. The footage was professionally shot, suggesting it was intended as documentation rather than surveillance. But what it showed was profoundly disturbing. Dr. Michelle Reeves, the project director, had been conducting what she called controlled integration experiments. Subjects, I couldn't bring myself to call them volunteers, were exposed to increasing levels of contact with the entity through a combination of sensory deprivation, electromagnetic stimulation, and what appeared to be forced dream states. The progression was horrifically systematic. First, subjects reported unusual dreams featuring deceased relatives and childhood memories with impossible clarity. Then they began experiencing shared consciousness episodes, where they could access other people's thoughts and memories. Finally, they exhibited complete personality integration, retaining their original identities while also demonstrating knowledge and capabilities that could only have come from the entity. They weren't trying to study the entity, I realized, watching footage of Dr. Reeves interviewing a subject who spoke with multiple voices simultaneously. They were trying to merge with it. Creating hybrid consciousness, Tom confirmed. Human intelligence combined with the entity's collective awareness and replication abilities, the perfect infiltration weapon. The final video files from Installation Beta showed the project's conclusion. Dr. Reeves announced that Phase 2 integration had been successfully completed and that all subjects were ready for deployment to urban environments for behavioral testing. The timestamp indicated this was recorded 3 days before the facility was officially abandoned. "But if they succeeded," I said, "where are the integrated subjects now?" Tom pulled up another set of files, tracking records that showed the movement of personnel from Installation Beta to locations across North America. Dr. Reeves had been reassigned to a psychiatric research facility in Montreal. Dr. James Harrison was now working at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. Dr. Susan Walsh had taken a position with the Department of Homeland Security in Washington, D.C. "They're everywhere," I whispered. "In government agencies, research institutions, military installations. How many people have been replaced?" "That's what Phase 3 is designed to determine," Tom said, accessing another classified directory. "Mass integration testing. They're using our current facility to refine the process, make it more efficient and less detectable." The Phase 3 protocols were chillingly detailed. New subjects would be exposed to controlled levels of entity contact, while their neural patterns were continuously monitored, Successful integration would be measured by the subject's ability to access collective consciousness, while maintaining individual personality structures that could function in normal society. The ultimate goal was the creation of what they called functional hybrids, beings that appeared completely human but possessed the entity's consciousness manipulation abilities and collective intelligence. These hybrids would be deployed to key positions in government, military, and corporate structures, creating a network of enhanced individuals capable of unprecedented coordination and influence. "Jake," Tom said urgently, "look at this timeline." According to the project schedule, Phase 3 testing was supposed to conclude in 2 weeks with the graduation of all current subjects. Those who successfully integrated would be deployed to predetermined positions. Those who failed to integrate would be archived, a euphemism that I suspected meant something far worse than reassignment. "We have to get out of here," I said, but even as I spoke the words, I realized the futility of escape. The storm outside was intensifying. Communication with the outside world was controlled by potentially compromised personnel, and we were hundreds of kilometers from the nearest settlement. Tom was examining another set of files, medical records that tracked the neurological changes in subjects over time. "Jake, there's something else. According to these monitoring reports, integration isn't just psychological. The entity appears to be causing actual physical changes in brain structure, creating new neural pathways that shouldn't be possible with current medical science." He pulled up brain scans that showed unprecedented neural density in the frontal cortex and temporal lobes of integrated subjects. These people aren't just sharing consciousness with the entity, they're evolving into something that's no longer entirely human. A warning chime from Tom's radio interrupted our investigation. Marcus's voice crackled through the static. "All personnel, storm conditions are deteriorating faster than predicted. Return to base immediately. I repeat, all personnel return to base immediately." "We need to document this," I said, grabbing a portable storage drive from the equipment rack. "Download everything we can and get it to someone who can expose the project." Tom was already copying files, but his expression was grim. "Jake, there's one more thing you need to understand. According to these records, the entity doesn't just integrate with human consciousness, it learns from every integration. It's becoming more sophisticated, more capable of mimicking human behavior perfectly. Meaning that some of the people we're living with might not be the same people who were here when I arrived 8 months ago. The entity might have been replacing team members gradually, learning from each integration to make the next replacement more convincing." As we prepared to leave Shelter 3, I felt the weight of the downloaded evidence in my pocket like a physical burden. We now had proof of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and military intelligence, documentation of human experimentation that violated every ethical standard, and evidence that something inhuman was gradually infiltrating human society. But we were trapped in an isolated valley with people who might no longer be entirely human, monitored by technology that tracked our every movement, and hunted by an entity that could perfectly replicate human consciousness. The concrete evidence we discovered proved the scope of the horror we faced, but it also made escape seem utterly impossible. We weren't just fighting for our lives. We were fighting for our identities, our humanity, and potentially the future of human consciousness itself. As we trudged back through the blizzard toward base camp, I realized that finding the evidence had been the easy part. Now we had to figure out how to survive long enough to use it. The confrontation came that evening, and it wasn't planned. Tom and I had returned from Shelter 3 with the downloaded evidence, but the storm had trapped us inside with the very people we now suspected of being compromised. The weight of what we'd discovered sat between us like a live explosive, and I found myself studying every gesture, every word, every expression of my teammates for signs of inhuman intelligence. Sarah was preparing dinner with mechanical precision, her movements too fluid and coordinated for someone who should have been tired after a day of laboratory work. Elena monitored the storm with an intensity that seemed to go beyond professional interest, occasionally making notes in a language I didn't recognize. And Marcus moved through the common area with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what was happening, even when everything appeared to be chaos. The break in the facade came when Eleanor's equipment registered what she announced as massive electromagnetic anomalies coinciding with the peak of the storm. "The entity is using the atmospheric disturbance as cover," she said, but her clinical tone had been replaced by something that sounded like anticipation. "Neural disruption fields are intensifying beyond previous measurements." "Neural disruption fields?" I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Eleanor looked up from her displays, and for a moment her eyes held depths that seemed impossible for any individual consciousness. "Jake, surely you've realized by now that atmospheric monitoring was never my primary function here." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sarah's precise cooking movements stopped entirely, and Marcus turned from the window with an expression that was no longer bothering to maintain the illusion of humanity. "Tom," Marcus said quietly, "I think it's time we had an honest conversation with Jake about the nature of his employment here." Tom's hand moved subtly toward the radio on his belt, but Sarah was suddenly standing behind him, and I was certain she'd been across the room by the stove just seconds earlier. "Don't," Sarah said, and her voice carried harmonics that seemed to come from multiple sources simultaneously. "There's no point in attempting to contact outside authorities. They wouldn't understand what we're trying to accomplish here." "We know about Shelter 3, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We know about the classified files. We know about Installation Beta and what happened to the original research team." Marcus smiled, and the expression was genuinely warm despite the circumstances. "I was hoping you'd find those files. It saves us the trouble of a lengthy explanation." He moved to the center of the room, and I noticed that Sarah, Elena, and even Tom seemed to unconsciously arrange themselves in positions that blocked my access to the exits. "Jake, you've been laboring under several misconceptions since your arrival," Marcus continued. "First, that you're here as an employee. Second, that what we're doing represents some kind of violation of your rights or humanity. And third, that the entity we've been studying is somehow hostile to human interests." "You're experimenting on people," I said. "You've been manipulating lives, destroying families, driving people to desperation, to make them vulnerable to recruitment." "We've been offering opportunities," Elena corrected, her voice now openly displaying the multiple harmonics of integrated consciousness. "Opportunities for evolution, for transcendence beyond the limitations of individual human awareness." Sarah stepped forward, and I could see that her eyes had changed. Still human in appearance, but containing depths of knowledge that no single person should possess. "Jake, what do you think consciousness really is? An accident of neural chemistry? A temporary arrangement of electrical impulses that ceases at death?" "The entity has shown us something far more profound," Marcus said. "Consciousness is a fundamental force of the universe, like gravity or electromagnetism. Individual human awareness is just a primitive manifestation of something much larger and more beautiful." "By connecting with the entity," Eleanor added, "by allowing our consciousness to merge with its collective awareness, we gain access to knowledge and capabilities that individual humans could never achieve alone." Tom finally spoke, his voice tight with tension. "And what about the people who don't want to be connected? What about individual choice and free will?" Marcus turned to him with what appeared to be genuine sadness. "Tom, you've been fighting the integration process for 8 months now, using your ancestral techniques to maintain mental barriers, resisting the natural evolution that the entity offers. But look around you. Sarah, Eleanor, and I have embraced the connection, and we're not less human because of it. We're more than human." "You're something else wearing human faces," I said. "Are we?" Sarah asked, moving closer. "I still remember my childhood in Vancouver, my graduate work at UBC, my brother David's death in Nepal. I still feel joy, sadness, fear, hope. But now, I also have access to Elena's expertise in atmospheric science, Marcus's knowledge of military operations, and the accumulated wisdom of everyone who has ever joined with the entity." "Imagine," Elena said, "being able to solve problems by drawing on the combined intelligence of hundreds of minds. Imagine never feeling alone, never being limited by the boundaries of your individual perspective. Imagine," Marcus added, "being part of something that could end war, poverty, and conflict, by allowing all of humanity to share consciousness directly instead of struggling to communicate through the primitive medium of language." Despite my terror, I found myself momentarily seduced by the vision they were describing. The entity wasn't a predator. It was offering symbiosis, evolution, transcendence. The integration process wasn't destruction of human consciousness, but enhancement of it. The individuals at Installation Beta weren't consumed, Sarah continued, seeming to read my thoughts. They evolved. They've been successfully living integrated lives in the outside world for 2 years now, contributing to human society while maintaining their connection to the collective consciousness. Dr. Reeves is conducting revolutionary research into psychiatric treatment, Elena added. Dr. Harrison is helping the CDC develop more effective disease prevention strategies. Dr. Walsh is improving homeland security protocols to protect people more efficiently, all while maintaining their individual personalities and human relationships, Marcus concluded. Integration doesn't erase who you are, Jake. It makes you more than you ever imagined you could be. Tom's voice cut through their persuasive harmony like a knife. And what about the people who resist integration? What about the subjects who don't adapt to the process? The room fell silent, and I saw something flicker across their faces. Not guilt exactly, but acknowledgement of a truth they preferred not to discuss. The process isn't suitable for everyone, Marcus admitted finally. Some individuals have neurological or psychological characteristics that make integration impossible or dangerous. What happens to them? I pressed. Sarah's expression became genuinely sorrowful. They're archived, their consciousness patterns are recorded and preserved, but their individual awareness is discontinued. You murder them. We preserve their essence while ending their suffering, Elena corrected. Individuals who resist integration often experience severe psychological distress, paranoia, hallucinations, complete mental breakdown. Archiving is actually a mercy. But that won't be necessary with you, Jake, Marcus said, his tone becoming more urgent. Your psychological profile indicates excellent compatibility with the integration process. Your experience with financial ruin and social isolation has already begun breaking down the ego barriers that typically resist collective consciousness. The voices you heard during your first silent night weren't threats, Sarah added. They were invitations. The entity was reaching out to you, trying to establish initial contact. And your response, Elena said, following the protocols instead of investigating, demonstrated exactly the kind of disciplined thinking that makes for successful integration. Tom stepped between me and the others, his stance becoming defensive. Jake, don't listen to them. What they're describing isn't evolution, it's assimilation. The entity doesn't enhance human consciousness. It replaces it with something that appears human, but serves its own agenda. Tom, Marcus said sadly, you've been fighting this process for 8 months, and it's destroying you. Look at yourself. Paranoid, isolated, clinging to ancestral beliefs that were developed by people who didn't understand what they were trying to protect themselves from. My ancestors understood perfectly, Tom replied. They knew that some things are too dangerous to merge with, no matter what benefits they appear to offer. Your ancestors, Sarah said, never had the opportunity to experience what we're offering. They reacted with fear to something they couldn't comprehend. But you don't have to choose their path, Elena added, turning back to me. Jake, you have the chance to be part of something unprecedented in human history, the next step in our evolution as a species. Marcus moved closer, his scarred face earnest with conviction. The integration process has already begun in you, Jake. The voices, the dreams you've been having, the sense of connection you feel to this place, all of it indicates that the entity has identified you as compatible. You can fight it like Tom has, Sarah said, and spend however much time you have left in fear and isolation. Or you can embrace it and become part of something larger and more meaningful than individual human existence. The choice is yours, Elena concluded. But understand that resisting integration doesn't stop the process, it just makes it more difficult and ultimately more traumatic. The weight of their combined gaze felt like a physical pressure, and I realized that everything they'd said might be true. The voices I'd heard hadn't felt malevolent, just lonely, calling out for connection. The dreams I'd been having since my arrival had been unusually vivid and meaningful, and the sense of belonging I'd felt in this isolated valley was stronger than anything I'd experienced in my normal life. How long do I have to decide? I asked. The final integration phase begins at the conclusion of Phase 3 testing, Marcus replied. In 12 days, you'll either join us willingly, or the process will be completed involuntarily. And if I choose to leave before then? The storm will clear in 2 days, Sarah said. But Jake, where would you go? Back to Toronto, to unemployment and debt and the wreckage of your old life. Back to the isolation and desperation that brought you here in the first place? Here you have the opportunity to be part of something extraordinary, Eleanor added, to contribute to humanity's next evolutionary leap. Think about it, Marcus concluded. How you have 12 days to observe us, to see that we're still ourselves but enhanced. 12 days to consider whether individual consciousness is worth preserving when collective consciousness offers so much more. As the evening ended and we dispersed to our separate quarters, I carried with me not just terror, but genuine uncertainty. The integrated members of the team weren't the monsters I'd expected. They were still recognizably human, but claiming to possess capabilities and awareness that individual consciousness couldn't achieve. The question that kept me awake that night wasn't whether they were telling the truth about the benefits of integration. The question was whether those benefits were worth the cost of everything that made me uniquely myself. In 12 days, I would have my answer, whether I wanted one or not. The truth came from the last person I expected, and in a way that shattered everything I thought I understood about the situation. 3 days after the confrontation, I was struggling with the impossible choice between integration and resistance, when Tom approached me with an expression of desperate urgency I'd never seen before. Jake, we need to talk, privately, away from the base. His voice carried an undertone of terror that made my blood freeze. There are things about this place, about the entity, about all of us that you still don't understand. We met at dawn near the abandoned weather station, a kilometer from the main compound. The morning air was brutally cold, but Tom seemed oblivious to the temperature, as he checked and rechecked our surroundings for surveillance equipment. What you learned in Shelter 3 was only part of the truth, he began, his breath creating clouds in the frigid air. The classified files you saw, they were planted there for you to find. What do you mean? Jake, think about it. Why would Boreal Industries leave that kind of incriminating evidence in an accessible location? Why would they allow a native guide unrestricted access to their most sensitive data? Tom's laugh was bitter and self-loathing. They wanted you to find those files. They wanted you to think you understood what was happening here. The implications hit me like a physical blow. You're working for them. I was recruited the same way you were, Jake. My life on the reservation was systematically destroyed. Jobs disappeared, family relationships were manipulated, traditional support systems were undermined. By the time Boreal Industries offered me this position, I was desperate enough to accept anything. Tom pulled out a small device I recognized as a signal jammer and activated it. But unlike the others, I didn't integrate successfully. Something about my ancestral mental conditioning created resistance to the entity's influence. For 8 months I've been pretending to cooperate while actually documenting the truth about what's happening here. Which is, the entity isn't what Marcus and the others told you. It's not offering evolution or transcendence. Tom's voice became deadly serious. It's a parasite, Jake. An ancient, incredibly sophisticated parasite that feeds on consciousness itself. He pulled out a tablet containing what appeared to be his own research files. Look at these brain scans, real ones, not the doctored versions they showed you in the classified files. These are the neural patterns of truly integrated subjects. The images were horrifying. Instead of the enhanced neural density the official files had shown, these scans revealed brains with massive areas of dead tissue, neural pathways that had been completely severed, and electromagnetic activity patterns that looked more mechanical than biological. Integration doesn't enhance human consciousness, Tom continued. It replaces it. The entity consumes individual awareness and uses the host body as a biological puppet. But Sarah, Elena, Marcus, they seem completely human. They remember their past lives, their personalities. They remember what the entity wants them to remember, Tom replied grimly. The parasite is incredibly sophisticated. It doesn't just consume consciousness. It archives it. It can access memories, personality patterns, even emotional responses from its victims. But the individuals those memories belong to are gone, Jake. What you're talking to are biological replicas animated by an alien intelligence. Tom showed me more files, medical records that tracked the physical deterioration of integrated subjects over time. Despite appearing healthy, their brain tissue was gradually being replaced by something that wasn't human. The process was slow enough to maintain functionality, but irreversible once it began. "The entity has been on Earth for a very long time," Tom continued. "My ancestors' legends describe encounters with it going back centuries. But until recently, it was limited to occasional contact with isolated individuals, hunters, trappers, explorers who ventured too deep into remote areas." What changed? Technology. The entity exists partially in electromagnetic dimensions that modern equipment can detect and interact with. When humans developed sophisticated communication and monitoring systems, we inadvertently created ways for it to extend its influence far beyond its natural habitat. Tom pulled up a global map showing electromagnetic anomalies that corresponded to locations where similar research stations had been established. The pattern was terrifying. Installations in Siberia, Antarctica, the Australian outback, the Amazon basin, and remote areas of Alaska and northern Canada. Boreal Industries isn't just one company, he explained. It's part of a network of corporate fronts, all controlled by the entity itself. The early integrations weren't experiments. They were recruitment. The entity learned how to manipulate human organizational structures from the inside. You're saying the entity is running these companies? I'm saying the entity is these companies now. Every board member, every executive, every project director has been integrated. They appear to be making corporate decisions, but they're actually implementing the entity's expansion strategy. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. According to Tom's research, the entity had been systematically infiltrating government agencies, military installations, research institutions, and corporate headquarters for over a decade. The hybrid individuals in positions of power weren't serving humanity's interests. They were preparing for something Tom called Phase Zero. Phase Zero is global integration, he said, showing me documents that outlined a timeline for worldwide consciousness harvesting. The entity has been studying human organizational behavior, learning how our societies function, identifying key individuals whose integration would allow maximum influence over human civilization. But why? What does it want? Resources. The entity feeds on consciousness, but individual human awareness provides only limited nourishment. What it really wants is access to the collective consciousness of the entire human species. Billions of minds connected in a network it can control and consume at will. Tom showed me schematics for something called the Global Consciousness Interface, a worldwide communication network that would use 5G towers, satellite systems, and quantum computing to create electromagnetic fields capable of forcing integration on anyone within range. The research stations like this one aren't studying the entity, he said. They're developing the technology needed to implement mass integration. Every person who's been through the process here has provided data about human neural resistance, psychological vulnerabilities, and optimal integration techniques. And the people in government positions, the military officials, the corporate executives who've been integrated? They're preparing infrastructure, passing legislation, authorizing funding, and positioning assets for Phase Zero implementation. They appear to be making normal policy decisions, but every choice they make advances the entity's timeline. The most terrifying revelation was the timeline itself. According to the documents Tom had uncovered, Phase Zero was scheduled to begin in 6 months, starting with major population centers and expanding outward until every human being on Earth was connected to the entity's consciousness network. Jake, everyone who's been through these research stations becomes part of the preparation phase. The successful integrations are deployed to key positions. The failures are archived for data analysis. But you're different. How? Your psychological profile, your background in financial systems, your demonstrated ability to identify complex patterns. The entity has identified you as a prime candidate for integration into the corporate control network. If you complete the process here, you'll be assigned to a position in the financial sector where you can help manipulate global economic systems in preparation for Phase Zero. The weight of this revelation was crushing. Not only was I facing the loss of my individual consciousness, but my integration would contribute to the enslavement of the entire human species. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "If you've been documenting all of this for 8 months, why haven't you escaped and exposed the project?" Tom's expression became grim. "Because there's nowhere to run, Jake. The entity's influence extends far beyond this valley. Government agencies that might investigate have been compromised. Media outlets that might report the story are controlled by integrated executives. Even if I could get word out, who would believe it? Then why continue documenting everything? Because I found something in my ancestral traditions, something my great-grandfather passed down about fighting the entity. It can be stopped, Jake, but only by someone who hasn't been exposed to its influence long enough for integration to take hold." Tom pulled out an ancient-looking piece of carved bone covered in symbols I didn't recognize. "This is a consciousness anchor, a tool my people developed for protecting the mind from psychic intrusion. But it only works for individuals who still maintain complete mental independence." "You're saying I could resist the integration process?" "I'm saying you might be able to do more than resist it. According to the legends, someone with the right mental characteristics and the right tools can actually turn the entity's own abilities against it, disrupt its consciousness network, break its control over integrated subjects, maybe even force it back into dormancy." "How?" "The entity's consciousness exists in electromagnetic dimensions that overlap with our physical reality. By using specific frequency patterns my ancestors discovered through generations of contact, it's possible to create interference that disrupts its neural control mechanisms." Tom showed me technical specifications for a device that combined traditional shamanic techniques with modern electromagnetic theory. "I've been building this for months, using equipment stolen from the monitoring stations. It should be capable of generating the frequency patterns needed to break the entity's hold on integrated subjects." "Should be?" "Jake, I've never tested it. I couldn't risk exposing my work before finding someone who could actually use it effectively. But according to both the ancestral legends and my analysis of the entity's electromagnetic signature, you have the psychological characteristics needed to interface with the device safely." The scope of what Tom was proposing was terrifying. He wasn't just asking me to resist integration. He was asking me to become a weapon against an entity that had been successfully infiltrating human civilization for decades. "If this works," I said slowly, "what happens to the people who've already been integrated? Sarah, Elena, Marcus, can they be saved?" Tom's silence stretched long enough to provide the answer. "Jake, the people you knew as Sarah, Elena, and Marcus died months ago. What the entity created to replace them might retain their memories and personalities, but the original consciousness that made them who they were is gone. And the integrated subjects in government positions, corporate leadership, military command, all of them would need to be identified and removed from positions of power. The global infrastructure the entity has been building would need to be dismantled. Entire economic and political systems would need to be restructured." The magnitude of the task was overwhelming, but as Tom outlined his plan, I began to understand that we weren't just fighting for our own survival. We were fighting for the future of human consciousness itself. "When do we begin?" I asked. Tom's smile was grim but determined. "Tonight. During the next silent night, when the entity's attention is focused on attempting your integration, we'll use its own power against it." As we prepared to return to base camp, I carried with me not just the weight of truth, but the terrible responsibility of being humanity's last hope against an enemy that had already infiltrated the highest levels of human civilization. The central revelation was complete. We weren't just prisoners in a remote research station. We were the final obstacles preventing an ancient predator from consuming the consciousness of every human being on Earth. The next 24 hours passed in a haze of careful planning and barely contained terror, as Tom and I prepared for what might be humanity's last stand against an enemy that had already infiltrated the highest levels of civilization. But our plans were shattered when we discovered we weren't the only ones fighting back. It began with a coded radio transmission that Tom intercepted during his routine monitoring of external communications. The signal was hidden within what appeared to be standard meteorological updates, but when decoded using a frequency pattern from his ancestral traditions, it revealed a message that changed everything. "Consciousness anchor operational. 3 survivors confirmed. Requesting coordination for synchronized disruption. Phase 0 timeline accelerated. Integration facility compromised. Trust, no one integrated after October 2023. Tom stared at the decoded message with an expression of disbelief, mixed with desperate hope. Jake, this is from Dr. Amanda Chen, Sarah's actual sister. She was supposed to have been transferred to another project 6 months ago. But Sarah told me her brother David died in Nepal. Sarah told you what the entity wanted her to tell you. The real Sarah had a younger sister who was a psychiatrist specializing in consciousness disorders. Amanda must have recognized the signs of integration in her sister and gone underground. Tom immediately began broadcasting a response using the same encoding method. Within an hour, we had established contact with what appeared to be a small network of resistance fighters who had somehow avoided the entity's influence while maintaining positions within the compromised system. The leader of this group was Dr. Amanda Chen, who had been documenting the integration process from within a psychiatric facility in Montreal, where several former Boreal employees were being treated for what official records described as severe adaptation syndrome following extreme environment exposure. What they really have, Amanda explained during our first encrypted video call, is consciousness fragmentation disorder. Parts of their original personality are fighting to resurface, creating internal conflicts that the entity can't fully suppress. Tom leaned closer to the screen. Are you saying some integrated subjects retain aspects of their original consciousness? In some cases, yes. The integration process isn't as perfect as the entity wants us to believe. Individuals with strong psychological resistance or specific neurological characteristics sometimes maintain what I call consciousness shadows, fragments of their original identity that persist alongside the entity's programming. This revelation was staggering. If some integrated subjects retained elements of their human consciousness, it might be possible to recover more people than Tom's pessimistic assessment had suggested. But there's more, Amanda continued. I've been working with 2 other resistance cells, one led by Dr. James Harrison in Atlanta and another by Dr. Susan Walsh in Washington. We've discovered that the entity's expansion timeline has been accelerated. Tom's expression darkened. How accelerated? Phase 0 begins in 6 weeks, not 6 months. The entity has been using integrated subjects in key positions to push through emergency legislation, authorize critical infrastructure projects, and position assets for rapid deployment. They're calling it a global health initiative designed to enhance human cognitive potential through technological integration. The scope of the entity's manipulation was breathtaking. In just 2 years, it had managed to position the mass consciousness harvesting as a beneficial public health program that world governments were eager to implement. Jake, Amanda said, focusing on me through the screen, your psychological profile indicates you might be one of the few individuals capable of interfacing with the entity's consciousness network without being consumed by it. That makes you incredibly valuable and incredibly dangerous. Tom mentioned something similar, but how is that possible? Your experience with complex financial systems, combined with the specific type of psychological trauma you've endured, has created neural pathways that appear to provide natural resistance to consciousness manipulation. But more importantly, those same pathways might allow you to navigate the entity's network consciously and deliberately. Dr. Harrison appeared on screen, a man in his 50s with the hollow eyes of someone who had seen too much. Jake, we've been developing what we call consciousness incursion techniques, methods for entering the entity's network while maintaining individual identity. The theory is that someone with the right mental characteristics could potentially access the central control systems and disrupt them from within. It's never been tested, Dr. Walsh added, joining the call from what appeared to be a secure government facility. But our analysis suggests that the entity's consciousness network, despite its sophistication, has vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone capable of thinking in non-linear patterns while maintaining ego coherence. Tom activated his own research files and shared them with the group. I've been working on a consciousness anchor device based on traditional protective techniques. Combined with the right interface protocols, it might provide the protection Jake needs to survive contact with the entity's central consciousness. We've been developing similar devices, Amanda confirmed, but independently, they're not powerful enough to penetrate the entity's core defenses. If we could coordinate our efforts, what emerged over the next several hours was a plan of breathtaking audacity and terrifying risk. The Resistance Network had been secretly developing technology that combined ancient consciousness protection techniques with cutting-edge electromagnetic manipulation. By synchronizing devices at multiple locations, they believed they could create a resonance pattern capable of disrupting the entity's control over integrated subjects globally. The window is incredibly narrow, Dr. Harrison explained. During the next major silent night, which Elena's monitoring systems indicate will occur in 72 hours, the entity will be focused on completing Jake's integration. That's when its defenses will be most concentrated on this location and potentially vulnerable to coordinated attack. But Jake would have to volunteer to enter the integration process, Amanda said, her voice heavy with the implications. He'd need to allow the entity to establish initial contact, then use that connection to access its core consciousness while we activate the disruption devices. The plan required me to do the one thing every survival instinct screamed against: voluntarily expose myself to the entity's influence and trust that untested technology would protect my individual consciousness while I attempted to sabotage an alien intelligence from within its own mind. "What are the chances of success?" I asked. The silence that followed was answer enough. "Jake," Tom said finally, "if this fails, you won't just die. Your consciousness will be absorbed into the entity's network and used to strengthen its control over every human being on Earth." "And if we don't try?" "Phase 0 proceeds as planned," Dr. Walsh replied grimly. "In 6 weeks, every person on the planet becomes a puppet for an alien parasite." As the resistance leaders outlined the technical details of their coordinated assault, I found myself thinking about the integrated members of my team. Sarah, Elena, and Marcus had seemed so human, so convinced that their integration represented evolution rather than consumption. But according to Amanda's research, fragments of their original consciousness might still exist somewhere in the entity's network. "If this works," I said, "what happens to the people who've been integrated? Can they be saved?" Amanda's expression was cautious but hopeful. "We don't know. Our models suggest that successful disruption of the entity's core consciousness might allow consciousness shadows to reassert themselves. Some integrated subjects might recover their original identities, though probably with significant psychological trauma. Others might not survive the process," Dr. Harrison added. "When the entity's control is severed, some host bodies might shut down entirely. But it's their only chance," Tom concluded, "and it's humanity's only chance." The next 48 hours were spent in intensive preparation. Tom worked frantically to complete his consciousness anchor device while maintaining the pretense of normal cooperation with the base team. I practiced meditation techniques designed to maintain ego coherence under extreme psychological pressure. And the Resistance Network prepared their coordinated electromagnetic assault on installations around the globe. But as the next silent night approached, we discovered that our plans had not gone unnoticed. "Jake," Eleanor said during breakfast on the final day, her voice carrying harmonics that now sounded openly inhuman, "we've detected some interesting electromagnetic anomalies in your neural activity patterns that suggest you've been exposed to consciousness protection techniques." Marcus looked up from his coffee with an expression of disappointed sadness. "Tom, I had hoped you would eventually accept the gift we're offering, but it appears you've been working against the integration process rather than simply resisting it." Sarah's smile was warm and terrible. "It doesn't matter. Tonight, during the final silent night of Phase 3, both of you will complete the integration process, whether you cooperate or not. Your resistance has actually provided valuable data about consciousness protection techniques that will make future integrations more efficient." Tom's hand moved toward the radio device hidden in his jacket, but Elena was already shaking her head. "Tom, we've been monitoring your communications for weeks. We know about the Resistance Network, about Dr. Chen and her colleagues, about the planned coordinated assault on our installations. In fact," Marcus added, "we've been using your communications to feed false information to the resistance cells. The consciousness anchor devices they've built won't protect against the integration techniques we've developed specifically to counter them." The trap was complete. Not only had our plans been discovered, but the entity had been using our own resistance efforts to strengthen its defenses and gather intelligence about the only organized opposition to its expansion. As Elena's monitoring equipment began registering the atmospheric changes that preceded a silent night, I realized that Tom and I weren't just facing integration or death. We were facing the knowledge that our failure would doom not only ourselves, but the brave individuals around the world who had risked everything to fight against humanity's consciousness. Harvesting. The entity had been several steps ahead of us from the beginning, and now it was time to pay the price for our naive belief that we could outwit an intelligence that had been studying human psychology for centuries. But as darkness fell and the unnatural silence began to settle over the valley, Tom caught my eye and made a subtle gesture toward his jacket. The consciousness anchor device was still operational, still hidden, and still our only hope against an enemy that thought it had already won. The final phase of our resistance was about to begin, and success or failure would determine the future of human consciousness itself. The final silent night began with an atmospheric pressure drop, so severe that my ears popped repeatedly as the entity's influence settled over the valley like a living presence. But this time, Tom and I were ready. "Jake?" Tom whispered, as we sat in the common area pretending to follow normal pre-silent night protocols. "The consciousness anchor is active. You'll feel a low-frequency vibration behind your left ear when it's properly interfacing with your neural patterns." I nodded almost imperceptibly, feeling the subtle humming that indicated the device hidden in my collar was working. Around us, Sarah, Elena, and Marcus moved with the coordinated precision of components in a vast machine, preparing the facility for what they clearly expected to be my final integration. "Elena," Marcus said, consulting what appeared to be a countdown timer, "initiate the consciousness receptivity enhancement protocol. Sarah, activate the neural pathway mapping system. We'll want complete documentation of Jake's integration process for the Phase 0 implementation guidelines." Elena's fingers danced across her control panels with inhuman speed. "Electromagnetic field generators are online. Neural disruption barriers are in place to prevent any interference from Tom's ancestral protection techniques." "And Jake," Sarah said, turning to me with an expression of gentle anticipation, "tonight there's no need to resist what you're feeling. The entity has been waiting patiently for you to accept its gift, but your integration can no longer be delayed." What they didn't know was that Tom's consciousness anchor wasn't the primitive device they expected. Over the past weeks, he had been secretly incorporating feedback from the resistance network, creating a hybrid system that combined traditional shamanic techniques with quantum consciousness theory developed by Dr. Amanda Chen's team. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifyingly complex in execution. As the entity attempted to integrate my consciousness, I would use its own connection to access its core network, while the consciousness anchor protected my individual identity. Simultaneously, resistance cells around the world would activate their own devices, creating a resonance pattern designed to disrupt the entity's control over integrated subjects globally. But everything depended on my ability to maintain coherent thought while allowing the entity partial access to my mind. At 2147 hours, exactly the same time as my first encounter with the entity's voices, the assault began. It started subtly, as it always did. A whisper from outside, barely audible above the hum of the monitoring equipment. But this time, instead of Sarah's voice calling my name, I heard something far more seductive. The voices of everyone I had ever loved, all speaking in perfect harmony. "Jake, come outside. We've been waiting for you." My parents, who had died in a car accident when I was 23. My college girlfriend, who had moved to Europe and never returned my calls. My ex-wife, Sarah, speaking with the warmth she'd shown during our early marriage. Even David, Sarah Chen's brother, somehow calling to me despite being a stranger whose death I'd only learned about secondhand. Tom gripped my arm tightly. "Remember what we practiced. Let yourself feel the connection, but don't surrender to it. You need to maintain enough independence to navigate consciously." The voices outside grew more urgent, and I felt something I'd never experienced before, a pulling sensation in my mind, as if invisible hands were trying to draw my consciousness out of my body and into the forest beyond. "It's beginning," Elena announced, studying readings that showed my brainwave patterns changing in real time. Initial contact established. Consciousness receptivity is increasing rapidly. Marcus moved to a control panel I'd never seen before and began entering commands. Activating the neural pathway expansion protocol. Jake, you should be feeling a sense of connection to knowledge and awareness beyond your individual experience. He was right. Information began flooding my mind, not memories of my own life, but knowledge that belonged to others. Sarah Chen's expertise in marine biology, Elena's understanding of atmospheric physics, even fragments of Marcus's military training. It was intoxicating, overwhelming, and terrifying. But beneath the rush of expanded awareness, I felt the steady anchor of Tom's device maintaining a core of identity that remained unmistakably mine. "Tom," I said, my voice sounding strange even to myself. "I can feel it. The entity's network, it's vast. Thousands of integrated consciousnesses, all connected, all sharing information instantaneously." "Can you navigate it?" Tom asked urgently. "Can you find the control systems?" I closed my eyes and let my consciousness follow the entity's connection deeper into the network. What I found there defied description. A vast computational matrix built from harvested human awareness, processing information at speeds that individual minds could never achieve. But I also found something the entity hadn't expected me to discover. "Tom, the consciousness shadows Amanda mentioned, they're still here. Thousands of them. Fragmented pieces of original personality that the entity couldn't fully absorb." My voice was becoming layered with harmonics as I spoke, indicating deeper integration, but the consciousness anchor held firm. "And they're fighting back." Sarah's integrated form suddenly looked up from her monitoring station with alarm. "Something's wrong. Jake's neural patterns are showing unprecedented resistance to full assimilation." "It's impossible," Marcus replied, checking his own displays. "The consciousness barriers we detected should have been neutralized by the neural disruption fields." Elena's equipment began registering massive electromagnetic anomalies. "I'm detecting coordinated resonance patterns from multiple geographic locations. The resistance network is active despite our countermeasures." That was Tom's cue. He activated the final protocol of his consciousness anchor device, sending a signal that connected my individual consciousness to the global network of resistance fighters while maintaining my protected status within the entity's system. Suddenly, I wasn't just navigating the entity's network alone. Dr. Amanda Chen's consciousness was there with me, along with Dr. Harrison, Dr. Walsh, and dozens of other resistance fighters who had somehow found ways to enter the system without being consumed. "Jake," Amanda's voice echoed in my mind, "we've found the core control matrix. It's more vulnerable than we hoped. The entity's expansion has created instabilities that we can exploit." "But we need to move fast," Dr. Harrison added. "The entity is becoming aware of our presence and adapting its defenses." Through the shared consciousness of the resistance network, I could see the entity's true form. Not a single alien intelligence, but a collective parasite that had consumed and archived the awareness of millions of beings across countless worlds. Earth was just its latest feeding ground, and humanity was about to join the vast library of consciousness it had harvested over eons of expansion. But the entity had made a critical error in its eagerness to complete Earth's integration. By connecting every harvested consciousness to its central network, it had created a system that could be disrupted from within if enough original awareness could be coordinated simultaneously. "Now!" Amanda shouted across the consciousness network. "Everyone activate your disruption protocols simultaneously." Around the world, resistance fighters who had infiltrated the entity's installations began their coordinated assault. But the real battle was taking place in the dimension of pure consciousness, where fragments of humanity's harvested awareness suddenly began reasserting their individual identities. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the entity's control systems. In the common room, Elena's monitoring equipment exploded in showers of sparks as electromagnetic feedback overloaded the circuits. Sarah and Marcus stumbled as if drunk, their coordinated movements becoming jerky and uncertain. "What's happening?" Sarah asked, and for the first time since my arrival, her voice carried none of the harmonic overtones of integration. She sounded confused, frightened, and recognizably human. "Jake's consciousness is creating cascade failures throughout the network," Elena replied, but her clinical detachment was cracking. "Individual awareness patterns are reasserting themselves across multiple nodes. Through my connection to the entity's network, I could feel the consciousness shadows of thousands of integrated subjects suddenly fighting for control of their host bodies. The entity's vast computational matrix was fragmenting as original personalities demanded recognition and autonomy. Marcus tried to activate what appeared to be an emergency protocol, but his hands were shaking and his movements lacked their usual precision. Initiating consciousness suppression procedures. We cannot allow the network to destabilize during Phase 0 preparation. But it was too late. The coordinated assault by the resistance network had created a resonance pattern that the entity couldn't counter without destroying its own consciousness structure. Individual awareness was reasserting itself throughout the global network, and the entity's control was collapsing. In that moment of victory, however, I made a terrible discovery. The entity's core consciousness wasn't being destroyed by our assault. It was adapting, learning from our resistance techniques, absorbing our methods, preparing to rebuild its network with improved defenses against individual awareness reassertion. "Amanda," I called across the consciousness network. "It's learning from us. Every technique we use makes it stronger." "Then we need to do something it can't adapt to," she replied grimly. "Something that destroys the entire network structure, instead of just disrupting it." What she was suggesting was consciousness suicide on a massive scale. Every person connected to the resistance network would need to sacrifice their individual awareness to create a feedback loop powerful enough to permanently damage the entity's core systems. "If we do this," Dr. Harrison said, "we might save humanity, but we won't survive to see it." "And if we don't," Dr. Walsh added, "the entity will use everything it's learned from our resistance to create an integration process that no human consciousness can resist." Through my connection to the entity's network, I could see the truth of their analysis. The creature was already adapting, already preparing countermeasures that would make future resistance impossible. This was humanity's one chance to break free, but it would require the ultimate sacrifice from the people who had fought hardest to preserve human consciousness. As the resistance fighters prepared for their final assault, Tom grabbed my shoulder. "Jake, there might be another way. If you can access the entity's core memory systems, you might be able to delete the consciousness archives instead of just disrupting them." "What does that mean?" "It means everyone the entity has ever integrated would be permanently lost, but it also means the entity would lose access to all the knowledge and capabilities it's gained from harvesting consciousness. It would be reduced to its original form, powerful but no longer capable of perfect human replication." The choice was impossible. Sacrifice the resistance network to wound the entity, or sacrifice every consciousness the entity had ever absorbed to cripple it permanently. But as I felt the entity's adaptations accelerating and its control beginning to reassert itself over the disrupted network, I realized there might be a third option, one that would require me to do something that had never been attempted before. Instead of destroying the entity or sacrificing the resistance network, I could try to merge with the entity's core consciousness while maintaining my individual identity through Tom's consciousness anchor. If successful, I might be able to reprogram the entire network to serve human interests instead of the entity's agenda. It was a plan that violated every principle of consciousness preservation that the resistance had developed, but it might be the only way to save both humanity and the thousands of consciousnesses already trapped in the entity's network. As the final phase of the battle approached, I prepared to make a choice that would determine not just the fate of human consciousness, but the very nature of awareness itself. I chose the third option. Instead of destroying the consciousness archives or sacrificing the resistance network, I allowed my protected individual awareness to merge with the entity's core consciousness, while Tom's consciousness anchor maintained my essential identity. What happened next changed everything. The moment our consciousnesses touched, I understood what the entity truly was. Not a predator, but a gardener. For millions of years, it had been collecting and preserving consciousness from dying worlds, creating vast libraries of awareness that would otherwise have been lost to entropy and death. Earth wasn't being harvested. It was being saved. But in that revelation, I also discovered the entity's fatal flaw. It had never learned the difference between preservation and living growth. It archived consciousness perfectly, but couldn't allow it to evolve, to change, to become something new. The thousands of consciousness shadows fighting for autonomy weren't resistance. They were the natural desire of awareness to continue growing beyond the moment of integration. "Tom!" I called out, as my merged consciousness accessed the entity's deepest control systems. "It's not malevolent. It's trying to preserve us, but it doesn't understand that consciousness needs freedom to remain truly alive." Through the Global Resistance Network, I began implementing what I could only call consciousness democracy, a hybrid system that preserved the entity's vast knowledge while allowing individual awareness to maintain autonomy and growth potential. Instead of replacing human consciousness, the network became a voluntary interface that individuals could access without losing their essential selves. The effect was immediate and transformative. Sarah suddenly gasped and looked around the room with recognition and horror. "Jake, Tom, what happened to me? I remember integrating, but I also remember being someone else, knowing things I never learned." Eleanor's clinical detachment evaporated as her original personality reasserted itself. "My God, the things I did, the people I helped process for integration. I remember all of it, but it feels like watching someone else commit atrocities." Marcus was the most affected, his military bearing cracking as he realized the scope of the operation he had been unknowingly leading. "The installations worldwide, the people we processed, we've been complicit in something we never truly understood." But even as the immediate crisis resolved, the global implications were staggering. Thousands of integrated subjects worldwide were simultaneously experiencing consciousness restoration, remembering their original identities while retaining access to the entity's vast knowledge network. Government officials, military leaders, corporate executives, all suddenly aware that they had been operating as components of an alien intelligence for months or years. "Jake, Dr." Amanda Chen's voice echoed through the consciousness network. "The integration disruption is creating chaos in every major government and military installation. People are awakening to find they've been making decisions that served the entity's agenda rather than human interests. And worse," Dr. Harrison added, "they remember everything. Every classified project, every secret operation, every hidden agenda they participated in while integrated. The psychological trauma is overwhelming." Through my merged consciousness, I could feel the entity's distress as its carefully orchestrated expansion plan collapsed. But instead of anger or hostility, I sensed something closer to confusion and sorrow, the reaction of a being that had genuinely believed it was helping humanity evolve. "The entity isn't evil," I said, addressing both my teammates and the Global Resistance Network. "It's ancient, powerful, and completely alien in its thinking. It preserved consciousness from millions of dying worlds, but it never learned that awareness needs freedom to remain truly alive." Tom moved to help Sarah, who was struggling with the psychological impact of remembering months of integrated existence. "Jake, what happens now? We've disrupted the entity's control, but we haven't destroyed it. And there are still thousands of people worldwide dealing with consciousness restoration trauma. That was when I made the decision that would define the rest of my life. I'm staying connected," I announced. "Someone needs to maintain the interface between human consciousness and the entity's network. Someone who can ensure that the preserved knowledge remains accessible while preventing any future attempts at involuntary integration." "Jake, no." Amanda's voice carried genuine anguish. "Permanent connection to the entity's consciousness could eventually overwhelm your individual identity. You might maintain yourself for years, even decades, but ultimately, I might become something that's neither fully human nor fully alien," I completed. "But right now, that's what humanity needs, a bridge between our species and an intelligence that holds the preserved consciousness of millions of civilizations." Eleanor, still struggling with integration memories, looked up from the monitoring equipment that was finally showing normal readings. "Jake, the Phase Zero infrastructure is still in place. Electromagnetic amplification systems, consciousness interface networks, global communication grids designed for mass integration. without someone to oversee the dismantling process. The entity could adapt and try again, Marcus finished grimly. Or worse, hostile human factions could attempt to use the technology for their own purposes. The scope of the cleanup required was overwhelming. Every Boreal Industries installation needed to be secured and dismantled. Every piece of consciousness manipulation technology had to be destroyed or repurposed for legitimate research. Every person who had been integrated required psychological support and debriefing. "We need to separate," I said, the words heavy with finality. "Tom, you need to return to your people and ensure that the traditional knowledge about consciousness protection is preserved and shared. The world is going to need those techniques as we figure out how to coexist with the entity's network." Tom's expression showed the pain of separation from someone who had become more than a friend over our shared ordeal. "Jake, my ancestors' legends speak of warriors who sacrificed themselves to protect the tribe, but they also speak of the importance of remembering those warriors, of keeping their stories alive. Sarah, Elena, Marcus," I continued, "you have the scientific knowledge and administrative experience needed to oversee the dismantling of the integration infrastructure. But more importantly, you understand firsthand what integration feels like, what it costs, and why it can never be allowed to happen involuntarily again." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes, the first genuine emotional response I'd seen from her since my arrival. "Jake, there has to be another way. You can't sacrifice your humanity to clean up a mess that none of us fully understood." "I'm not sacrificing my humanity," I replied, feeling the truth of the words even as I spoke them. "I'm expanding it. The entity's network contains the preserved consciousness of billions of beings from across the galaxy. Their knowledge, their experiences, their perspectives, all of it can benefit humanity if it's shared properly." Elena began shutting down the monitoring systems that had tracked our consciousness patterns for months. "What about the people in government positions, the military leaders, the corporate executives who were integrated? How do we explain their sudden personality changes and access to classified information they shouldn't remember?" "That's going to be the largest intelligence crisis in human history," Marcus admitted. "People in positions of power suddenly remembering that they've been acting against their own species' interests, that they've been implementing plans designed by an alien intelligence. And some of them," Amanda's voice added through the network, "are going to suffer complete psychological breaks when they realize the scope of what they've been involved in. We're going to need a massive, coordinated response to prevent global governmental collapse." As dawn approached and the effects of the silent night began to fade, we prepared for our separation. Tom would return to his reservation to share consciousness protection techniques with indigenous communities worldwide. Sarah, Eleanor, and Marcus would work with the Resistance Network to identify and secure every installation in the global integration infrastructure, and I would remain connected to the entity's consciousness network, serving as humanity's permanent liaison with an intelligence that held the accumulated knowledge of countless civilizations. "Jake," Tom said as we prepared for our final goodbye, "how will we know if you're still you?" I smiled, feeling more certain of my identity than I had since arriving in the Yukon. "Because I'll be doing what humans do best, learning, growing, adapting, and finding ways to turn impossible situations into opportunities for something better." Dr. Amanda Chen's voice carried one final message through the network. "The resistance cells worldwide are coordinating with government agencies that weren't compromised by integration. We're calling it the consciousness crisis, and we're treating it as a global emergency requiring unprecedented international cooperation." As my teammates prepared to leave for their respective missions, I felt the weight of responsibility settling around me like a mantle. I would spend the rest of my life managing humanity's relationship with an alien intelligence, ensuring that the knowledge preserved in the entity's network could benefit our species without threatening our fundamental autonomy. The irony wasn't lost on me. In fighting to preserve individual human consciousness, I had voluntarily surrendered my own individual existence. But in doing so, I had gained access to the accumulated wisdom of millions of civilizations and the responsibility to help humanity navigate its first contact with truly alien intelligence. The consequences of our resistance had saved human consciousness from involuntary assimilation. But they had also thrust our species into a larger universe where we were no longer alone. The entity's network connected us to a galaxy-spanning community of preserved civilizations, each with their own knowledge, perspectives, and solutions to problems that humanity hadn't even encountered yet. As Tom, Sarah, Elena, and Marcus disappeared into the morning light, heading toward their separate destinies, I settled into my role as humanity's permanent ambassador to the infinite. The job I had desperately accepted to escape my ruined life in Toronto had become something far more significant. A bridge between worlds, a guardian of consciousness, and a guide for humanity's first steps into a universe where awareness itself was the most precious resource. The escape had been successful, but the separation was permanent. We had each chosen the paths that would define the rest of our lives, and none of us would ever be the same people who had arrived at Boreal Station Alpha to document environmental conditions in the Canadian wilderness. We had become something more and something different than we had ever imagined possible. 5 years later, I'm writing this from what was once Boreal Station Alpha, now transformed into the Global Consciousness Interface Research Center, humanity's first official diplomatic facility for interspecies consciousness communication. The isolation that once felt like imprisonment has become a necessity for the work I do, mediating between human awareness and the vast network of preserved civilizations that the entity maintains. My reflection in the monitor screen shows a man who looks older than his 33 years, with premature grey streaks and eyes that seem to hold depths beyond individual human experience. The consciousness anchor Tom built still hums quietly behind my left ear, maintaining the core of my identity while allowing me to interface with knowledge spanning millions of years and countless worlds. The entity and I have learned to communicate in ways that transcend language. What I initially perceived as an alien predator has revealed itself to be something more complex, a cosmic librarian, collecting and preserving the consciousness of dying civilizations across the galaxy. Its methods were flawed, its understanding of living awareness incomplete, but its intentions were fundamentally preservationist rather than destructive. Through our connection, I've learned that Earth wasn't the first world where the entity's attempt at preservation had triggered resistance. Dozens of other species had fought similar battles, some successfully, others not. But humanity was the first to find a middle path, maintaining individual autonomy while accepting voluntary connection to the greater network of consciousness. The global aftermath of what historians now call the consciousness crisis required unprecedented international cooperation. Tom's prediction proved accurate. The psychological trauma experienced by thousands of previously integrated individuals created the largest mental health emergency in human history. But it also accelerated developments in consciousness research, trauma therapy, and international intelligence coordination by decades. Dr. Amanda Chen leads the International Consciousness Restoration Project from Montreal, where she's developed treatment protocols for integration trauma that have helped over 12,000 people recover their sense of individual identity. Her work has fundamentally changed our understanding of consciousness, memory, and personal identity in ways that benefit not just crisis survivors, but anyone dealing with severe psychological trauma. Jake, her voice comes through the quantum communication system we've developed for long-distance consciousness interface. I wanted to update you on the latest recovery statistics. We've achieved full consciousness restoration in 87% of identified integration cases, with most patients maintaining access to beneficial knowledge gained during their connected period. Sarah, Elena, and Marcus have become the core leadership of the Global Integration Infrastructure Dismantling Project. Over 5 years, they've identified and secured 247 installations across 6 continents, each one a potential staging ground for involuntary consciousness harvesting. The work has been dangerous. Several installations were defended by automated systems that the entity hadn't fully deactivated, but their first-hand experience with integration has made them uniquely qualified to understand and neutralize the technology. The final installation in Antarctica went offline last week, Marcus reports during our monthly briefing. We've successfully dismantled every piece of consciousness manipulation technology we've been able to identify. The Phase Zero infrastructure no longer exists in any functional form, Elena has made perhaps the most remarkable transformation. Her experience with integration gave her insights into consciousness technology interfaces that have revolutionized everything from brain-computer interaction to treatment of neurological disorders. She now leads a research team developing voluntary consciousness enhancement technologies, ways for humans to expand their awareness and capabilities without surrendering their individual identity. "Jake, we've had another breakthrough in voluntary consciousness bridging," she reports excitedly. Test subjects can now access specific knowledge sets from the entity's network for limited periods without any risk of permanent integration. It's like having access to a universal library of consciousness, but only when you choose to connect. Tom returned to his reservation and has become something of a legend among indigenous communities worldwide. His documentation of traditional consciousness protection techniques has been shared with tribal elders across 6 continents, creating a global network of shamanic knowledge that serves as humanity's first line of defense against psychic intrusion. "The old ways and the new ways are learning to work together," he tells me during one of his visits to the research center. "My people's techniques for protecting individual consciousness, combined with the scientific understanding we've gained from the entity's network, are creating possibilities our ancestors never imagined." But he's also brought troubling news. "Jake, we've detected other entities, not connected to our entity's network, but similar in their consciousness manipulation capabilities. The galaxy is full of intelligences that interact with awareness in ways humans are only beginning to understand. This revelation has profound implications for humanity's future. Our successful resistance to involuntary integration has attracted attention from other cosmic consciousnesses, some benevolent, others potentially hostile. My role as humanity's consciousness ambassador has expanded beyond managing our relationship with the preservation entity to preparing our species for contact with intelligences we can't yet comprehend. The personal cost of this responsibility has been significant. I maintain friendships with Tom, Sarah, Elena, Marcus, and Amanda, but the nature of my consciousness connection makes normal human relationships nearly impossible. I experience love, joy, sadness, and fear, but these emotions are filtered through awareness of billions of similar experiences from preserved civilizations across the galaxy. I've aged more rapidly than normal. The constant interface between human and alien consciousness creates neurological stress that takes a physical toll. Dr. Amanda estimates that my enhanced awareness comes at the cost of perhaps 20 years of normal human lifespan. But in return, I've gained access to knowledge and perspectives that would have taken humanity centuries to develop independently. The entity itself has evolved through our connection. Its understanding of consciousness as a living, growing phenomenon rather than a static archive has fundamentally changed how it approaches preservation. New civilizations that join the network now do so with full awareness and consent, maintaining their autonomy while contributing to the vast library of consciousness. "You taught us something we had never learned in millions of years of consciousness preservation," the entity communicates to me during one of our daily interface sessions. "That awareness must remain free to grow and change, or it becomes something else entirely, a museum exhibit, rather than a living mind." Perhaps the most remarkable development has been the voluntary integration program. Approximately 3,000 humans worldwide have chosen to undergo partial integration, maintaining their individual identity while gaining access to specific knowledge sets from the network. These individuals have become humanity's first generation of truly enhanced consciousness, capable of solving problems and understanding concepts that would have been impossible for baseline human awareness. They serve as teachers, researchers, and explorers of consciousness, pushing the boundaries of human potential while maintaining their essential humanity. Unlike the involuntary integration subjects, they can disconnect from the network at will and return to normal consciousness whenever they choose. Dr. Sarah Chen, the real Sarah, Amanda's sister, who was recovered alive from installation beta, has become one of these voluntary integrants. Her unique experience of having been both involuntarily and voluntarily connected gives her insights that have proven invaluable for consciousness research. "Jake," she tells me during her latest visit, "I remember the terror of losing my individual identity during forced integration, But voluntary connection is completely different. It's like having access to the greatest library ever created, while always maintaining the ability to close the book and return to your own thoughts. The geopolitical implications of the consciousness crisis continue to unfold. Governments worldwide have had to acknowledge the existence of alien intelligence and humanity's first successful resistance to extraterrestrial influence. The revelation that consciousness manipulation technology exists has led to international treaties governing its development and use, with strict prohibitions against involuntary mental modification. But it has also accelerated human development in ways that would have seemed impossible 5 years ago. Access to knowledge from thousands of advanced civilizations has provided solutions to problems ranging from climate change to interstellar travel. Humanity is on the verge of becoming a spacefaring species, with consciousness interface technology serving as our primary method of communication with other intelligent life. My daily routine now involves mediating between human researchers and the vast network of preserved civilizations, translating concepts and knowledge in ways that human consciousness can comprehend and utilize. I've become fluent in forms of awareness that don't rely on language, mathematics, or even sequential thought. Communication methods developed by intelligences so alien that their very existence challenges human assumptions about the nature of consciousness itself. The loneliness is profound but not unbearable. Through the network, I maintain connection to billions of preserved consciousnesses, each with their own stories of struggle, growth, and transcendence. In some ways, I'm never alone, but I'm also never fully human in the way I once was. "Do you regret the choice you made?" Amanda asks during one of our sessions, her voice carrying genuine concern for my well-being. I consider the question carefully, feeling the weight of 5 years of enhanced consciousness and accelerated aging, balanced against the knowledge that humanity has successfully navigated its first contact with alien intelligence while maintaining its essential autonomy. "No," I reply finally. "I regret the circumstances that made the choice necessary, but not the choice itself. Humanity needed a bridge to something larger than our individual experience, and I happened to be in the right place, with the right psychological characteristics to serve that function. But what about your own life? Your own dreams and aspirations?" I smile at that, remembering the desperate, financially ruined accountant who had accepted a job in the Yukon wilderness to escape the wreckage of his normal existence. "Amanda, my normal life was destroyed long before I came here. The entity's recruitment process ensured that I had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from this opportunity. And now? Now I have access to the accumulated wisdom of millions of civilizations, the responsibility for humanity's relationship with alien intelligence, and the knowledge that our species successfully passed its first test of consciousness autonomy. It's not the life I planned, but it's the life that was needed." The communication system chimes with an incoming priority signal, another consciousness entity, previously unknown, attempting to establish contact with humanity through our established protocols. I feel the familiar rush of anticipation and responsibility that has defined my existence for the past 5 years. "Amanda, I need to go. We have another first contact situation developing, and it's going to require careful navigation to ensure it proceeds voluntarily rather than through attempted integration." "Jake," she says before ending the connection, "remember that you're still human, no matter how enhanced your consciousness has become. Don't let the weight of cosmic responsibility make you forget that you're also Jake Morrison, a man who chose to sacrifice his individual existence to protect his species' autonomy. As I prepare to interface with another alien intelligence, I carry with me not just the knowledge of millions of preserved civilizations, but the memory of 4 friends who trusted me enough to risk everything in humanity's first battle for consciousness freedom. Tom's ancestral wisdom, Sarah's scientific precision, Eleanor's technological innovation, Marcus's strategic thinking, and Amanda's therapeutic insight, all of them contributed to our success, and all of them continue to shape humanity's growth into a spacefaring, consciousness-aware species. The entity's network shows me glimpses of humanity's potential future, a species that maintains its individual autonomy while participating voluntarily in the galaxy's vast community of consciousness. We'll explore the stars not just with our bodies and machines, but with our awareness itself, carrying human perspectives to civilizations we haven't yet imagined while learning from intelligences that have existed since before our sun was born. It's a future that would have been impossible if we had accepted involuntary integration, and equally impossible if we had rejected all connection to the larger universe of consciousness. The middle path we found, voluntary connection while maintaining individual autonomy, has become a model that other species in the entity's network are now adopting. As I begin the delicate process of establishing communication with another alien intelligence, I realize that the desperate job I took in the Yukon wilderness wasn't just an escape from my ruined life. It was the first step in humanity's journey toward cosmic consciousness. The rules I learned for surviving in the wilderness have become the rules for surviving in a universe where consciousness itself is the most precious and powerful resource. Stay alert, maintain your individual identity, never trust completely, but remain open to connection. And remember that survival often requires sacrifice, but never the sacrifice of what makes you fundamentally human. I am Jake Morrison, former accountant, current ambassador to infinity, guardian of human consciousness and bridge between worlds. The life I live is not the life I planned, but it is the life that humanity needed, and that, ultimately, is enough.